Welcome and thank you very much for joining us on episode 148 of the Blazers Edge podcast, presented to you today by BlazersEdge.com. I'm your weekend host, Chris Lucia.
And I'm your weekend co-host, Brandon Goldner. If you want to reach out to us, you can always hit us up at blazersedgepodcast@gmail.com. And remember, you can always find our work on iTunes, Stitcher, and YouTube. And for whatever amount of reviews or ratings or subscriptions that you want to give us, good, bad, or indifferent, we definitely appreciate the feedback.
Joining Brandon Goldner and I on the weekend podcast this week is Blazers Edge staff writer Eric Griffith. Eric, thanks for coming on, man. Just a day after the draft.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Chris. I'm looking forward to rehashing all of the non-action of last night.
Oh my gosh. So I feel like going into the draft, like all of us as Blazer fans, pretty much as NBA fans, I feel like everybody was very hyped going into this draft, saying, the value of draft picks in the first round is such that everybody who's not currently in the first round, and there were a number of teams, I think there was 5 or 6 other teams who didn't have a first round pick. They were going to be very, very active trying to get into that first round there. Boston had 3 picks of their own, Phoenix, Philly as well. And I believe you saw, how many of those picks that those 3 teams had, I think 8 of those 9 picks those teams hung on to. And so there wasn't quite, a lot of action, or at least as much as we anticipated heading into the draft. So, Eric, from the fallout of this 2016 draft, looking back in hindsight, were you surprised about what happened? Did anything catch you off guard with what happened last night in the draft?
So it wasn't necessarily with the draft, but Serge Ibaka heading to Orlando was definitely a huge deal. And I guess now we know that the Thunder have attached their front court wagon to the Steven Adams train, if we're going to mix some metaphors.
So winners and losers of that trade, I guess we can talk about that since that was the big one. We can go over that one first. Do you guys, either of you, have a response to who won and who lost that trade?
Chris, I'd say it was a home run for the Thunder. They got what they needed with, I think it was Oladipo now, and so now presumably they're not going to be relying on Dion freaking Waiters as their top guy off the bench. And let's take a look at that team. They just made the conference finals and were like 6 minutes from making the finals, and they probably improved. So I think you have to be happy with them if you're a Thunder fan.
And the other thing, too, is what's funny, I heard it felt immediately after the trade that people were like, yay, congratulations, Thunder, totally fleeced the Magic. And then after that, there was kind of this undertone, this undercurrent of, but Serge Ibaka meant so much to the Oklahoma City Thunder. I don't know if people remember that he regressed this year. He's been regressing defensively for the last couple of years, if I'm not mistaken. And the Thunder didn't particularly utilize him all that well. And so I don't know. It's funny that the narrative went from, Serge Ibaka is not as important as he used to be. They make this major trade, and now it's like, oh man, they really should have kept Serge Ibaka. I'm with Eric. I definitely am thumbs up on that trade.
And I think it's interesting what you're saying, because there's a good chance Ibaka could be revitalized basically in Orlando, because he fits perfectly with Vucevic in the front court right now. And so if anyone is set for a rebound year, you got to figure it's Serge Ibaka. He's not fighting with Steven Adams anymore. He has a cutout role on defense, and he's absolutely essential for that team.
And what were the Thunder really doing with Serge Ibaka late in the season and in the playoffs in terms of the offensive end of the floor, right? You have pretty much Russell Westbrook and Kevin Durant taking over the game. You have Dion Waiters coming in off the bench demanding a decent amount of touches. Serge Ibaka's role kind of became a pretty tertiary compared to what it used to be. I mean, he's not going to be your go-to offensive guy, particularly when you have the other kind of talent in the lineup. But in terms of just using him as a spot-up shooter, I feel like that's kind of underutilizing a talent like Serge Ibaka, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that I think about, too, is that people are criticizing Oladipo for not having much of a shot. Do you know how many NBA players came into the league with not much of a shot? Can we talk about Chris Paul didn't have much of a shot? Michael Jordan didn't really have much of a mid-range game until he got older. Blake Griffin was a terrible shooter, and now you could say he's at least serviceable. So, I mean, that's something that NBA players, if they're committed and they have the athleticism, they have the talent to do it, can absolutely get better at. So, I don't know. For me, again, I think it's definitely a win for the Thunder.
Shout out to Mason Plumlee. Hopefully, premature shout out.
So what we're hearing is pretty much what Russ Westbrook, Kevin Durant, Steven Adams are going to be starting, obviously, and then I believe I heard that Andre Robertson was going to be in that starting lineup as opposed to Depot. So you bring him off the bench, I believe, or you're still bringing Waiters off the bench. I mean, the lineup that those guys have, bringing in Oladipo, I mean, in Orlando, I guess you could say, I don't know, what option was he? Was he number 2 or number 3 behind Vucevic? I know he was probably a bit ahead of Peyton in that lineup in terms of offensively. So you bring him in and you say, look, you're a pretty distant third on that team in terms of what your role is offensively. So I think that's going to be a good position for Depot, where they're not relying on him to do as much. He can kind of play to his strengths a little bit more, as opposed to trying to create for everyone around him.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think that's true. And the other narrative that I want to put the kibosh on right now, that I heard particularly in Blazers circles, when the Thunder came out and they made some pretty innocuous comments about how this move does not indicate one way or the other whether Kevin Durant has indicated if he's going to stay or leave. Some people said, oh, yeah, well, it's the same thing the Blazers said when they traded Nick Batum, which I think is absolutely ridiculous. This is not the same kind of trade, not of the same magnitude at all. And so if anyone's hearing that narrative and is buying into it, I would just say sell.
Now, speaking of Blazers, before we have too many Russell Westbrook, Kevin Durant, Oklahoma Thunder hot takes on the Blazers Edge podcast.
Hey, I tried to connect it back to the Blazers right there.
And that's exactly where we're going, because I want to throw this out there to either of you. Is anybody disappointed with what went down with the Blazers last night? I know there was a ton of hype heading into the draft, but I mean, the number 47 pick is the only thing that the Blazers walked away with. I mean, I don't know if disappointing would be the right word, but it has to be surprising, right?
So it depends. In a vacuum, if you go with pre-draft expectations, I would say it's surprising, because we kept hearing how many picks were for sale. We saw over and over and over again, oh, look, there's 12 first-rounders that are teams are desperate to trade. The Celtics have to make a move. And so that's set up in your mind, oh, Neil O'Shea is definitely going to buy in because all of those picks are definitely for sale. And so if you went in with that expectation, it's a little disappointing, I think.
Not only was there that expectation, but even leading up to and during, like right before the draft, there was tons of smoke about various trades, which I'm sure, Chris, that we're going to get into in a bit. But just to say, so it was not only this expectation that Neil O'Shea himself had set up through his narrative and through his, positive drafting history, but also just the chatter right around and right before the draft started. I was absolutely convinced that something was going to happen and that something would involve the Blazers. It was just interesting how relatively quiet the draft ended up being.
I have one name for you guys, Marco Bellinelli.
Oh, man. And apparently that's what it takes to get into the mid to late first round in 2016. But I was looking at it and looking in hindsight, after all the chips had fallen and looking at it in its full context. And I was thinking about it like this. And I want you guys to correct me if I'm off on any of this. But my rationale here is, look, so you're looking at the number 12 pick, which ended up getting traded to the Atlanta Hawks, right? What did that end up taking? That required a player of Jeff Teague. I don't think the Blazers had any players that they were willing to part with of Jeff Teague's caliber. So if that was the asking price to get in there to the late lottery, I don't think the Blazers, that was ever a possibility really anyway. And you look at the teams that had those disposable quote unquote picks to get rid of, like we mentioned earlier in the podcast, 8 of those 9 picks they ended up holding on to.
Yeah, and the thing to remember about that too is there was all that smoke about all these picks that are for sale. There was the Marco Bellinelli trade, which seems to just be a Rich Cho fluke, because apparently he was interested in Bellinelli last year and didn't get him. So I'm just going to ignore that one for now and assume that was not the asking price for most picks.
If the person that you're pining over for over 2 seasons is Marco Bellinelli, then there's something going on.
And the Hornets look so good this year, and now this.
Oh.
Poor Hornets fans.
it's not the best trade in the world. Now the chatter was that in order to get that 22 pick from the Charlotte Hornets, that the team trading for it would have to take back the salary of either Spencer Hawes or Jeremy Lamb. And we still don't know 100%. I don't think the deal is going to be finalized until July 1st. So it may end up that one of those two players is actually involved in the deal. I believe that's a possibility. If not, if that were what Neil O'Shea were looking at to get that pick from Rich Cho, you look at taking back the salary of Spencer Hawes. I don't think that is really very helpful.
Do it, take it.
So my take on this, Eric, is that Spencer Hawes, the Clippers signed him for the mid-level a couple of years ago and could not wait to get rid of him. Traded him to the Charlotte Hornets, right? The Charlotte Hornets have him for a year. Can't wait to get rid of him. He's put on the trading block. I don't think this guy really meshes well from a chemistry standpoint on the teams that he's on.
But here's the thing. What he returns for you is worth it because, sure, he doesn't mesh well from a chemistry standpoint necessarily. So two things to consider there. Number one, the Blazers supposedly have better chemistry than almost any team in the league. So if he can get whipped into shape or whatever anywhere, it's going to be in Portland. Number two, he had a player option for that second year of his contract, which he's probably going to take because with the new salary cap, he's going to be worth more than $6 million a season. So you're just having a one-year rental of him for $7 million. And if you don't like that, send him home. And in return, you get a draft pick locked in at $1.5 million a year for 3 years. So in exchange for dealing with Spencer Hawes, you get a potential starter for $1.5 million a year for 3 years. I'll take that risk every time.
You risk that team chemistry because I'm trying to think of it in the context of Neil O'Shea, Terry Stotts, the Blazers front office. They obviously, you mentioned they have great team chemistry. I think it's pretty abundantly clear that they value that team chemistry above a lot of other things. I think they looked at who they could have potentially gotten at number 22 and they said, it's not worth it for potentially screwing up this team chemistry that we value so much.
Yeah, but I mean, that's true. But you're talking about Spencer Hawes. We're not talking about Rajon Rondo. We're not even talking about Dwight Howard. Spencer Hawes is not so when you, and just specific to those two examples I gave, you talk about Rajon Rondo and Dwight Howard. Those are two players who think very highly of themselves because both of those players used to be elite players. I mean, Rondo may be arguable that he was only elite for a short amount of time, but Dwight Howard was absolutely an elite player for many years. And so they both think very highly of themselves. How highly does Spencer Hawes really think of himself? I think I don't think that he would cause those kinds of chemistry issues as we see with other players.
But what he brings to the floor, though, is I think it's inconsequential enough that it's not worth taking that potential risk. I think that's pretty much what I'm getting at. If you're looking at the cost-benefit analysis here, what he could potentially bring in terms of net positives, I don't think that outweighs the risk of what he could potentially bring negatively because he could turn out to be a pretty poor player like he was for the LA Clippers. He could also be a malcontent. He could mess up that team chemistry.
Yeah, but it's not just what he brings. It's what the 22nd pick drafted by Neil O'Shea brings. O'Shea has a nearly perfect draft record. That pick is locked in at $1.5 million for 3 or 4 years. That's almost nothing. If you get anything out of that player, that trade immediately becomes a huge win.
So if we trust Neil O'Shea so much to be the guy drafting somebody that we can trust to be productive on the court in the future, then shouldn't we look at this and him not participating and getting into that number 22 slot? Shouldn't we look at it and say, he obviously didn't see anybody he could turn in to a legitimate talent down the road?
I think that's a very fair characterization. And the other thing you have to consider is that other teams, I mean, again, if you go with the pre-draft chatter, all the smoke that there was surrounding these various picks, that teams were very highly overvaluing these first-round picks. I mean, Chris, you were talking about it before we started recording, that a particular reporter who hopefully you can remember who they were and who they're associated with came out with a list of the various picks that were available in the first round. When you look at that list and say these picks are on the market, you would think that that would kind of devalue all of those picks because there are so many of them available. But despite that, almost nothing happened. I mean, Danny Ainge got caught with his pants down, in my opinion. I mean, and so for having said that, I think, yes, part of it is maybe Olshey evaluating the talent and not seeing anything he liked. But I think also part of it are those teams who had the draft picks were, for whatever reason, not willing to part with them.
So, first of all, the guy you're talking about is Chad Ford for ESPN. Yes? Yes.
Shout out to my best friend, Chad Ford.
And his tweet was draft picks for sale. By my count, that's picks 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 11, 12, 13, 14, 16, 19, 20, and 21 on the market. So that creates the impression that these picks are, it's a buyer's market, basically. You can get a pick for nothing.
He didn't even nail the one that actually went, like the number 22. He didn't even have that on the list.
Oh, you're right. I didn't even notice that.
That's funny.
But anyway, so the point is, though, that there was a weird disconnect where it's a low talent draft, but the picks are invaluable. They are basically a free player for 3 to 5 years, a free player. And so if that guy works out, you have a rotation piece for almost nothing because of the salary discrepancy. And so teams are going to be really hesitant to give that up short of a great offer. And so, yes, teams were willing to sell because there's no talent. But by the same token, they're only going to give it up if they can get a ton in return.
So, Eric, I think that most listeners know you as somewhat of a salary cap wizard. In about 30 seconds, can you explain to ignoramuses like me why the value of first-round picks is disproportionately higher this year than maybe they have been in the past and maybe they will be in the future?
Can we get some Jeopardy music overlaid here? All right. Picks in the 2016 draft were unusually valuable because the salary cap has exploded due to the TV contract, basically. And so in 2011, when the rookie scale was set, the picks were commensurate with a salary cap of like 60 million. The salary cap is now going to be 94 million. And so now you have a guy in the late first round taking up less than 2% of your salary cap who used to have taken up, maybe 5 or 6%. And so these are really low contracts that are incredibly high value. And next year, they're redoing the CBA, the collective bargaining agreement, which means this is the last chance to get a guy on this low rookie scale.
All right, so that being the conventional wisdom, I think, most of us who are really invested in the team and watching the draft, we kind of knew that going in, and then we see nothing happen. So that being the conventional wisdom, I have to ask, what would be the reason why Neil Olshey wouldn't pull out all the stops just to get into the first round?
Let me take a crack at this. I do think that a lot of it has to do with teams overvaluing their picks. For example, there was a particular deal out there for the number 3 pick. Boston had the number 3 pick. There was a deal that was suggested. I mean, this is a rumor. Suggested from the Philadelphia 76ers that they would trade Nerlens Noel, Covington, 24 and 26. I believe I have that right, for the number 3 pick. I think all of us, again, we talked about this off air, that's a pretty decent haul if you're the Boston Celtics. That could have been, if that move had gone down, that could have been the move to open up lots of other moves, because then the Celtics have now 2 more first-round draft picks, and they're going to have to deal those, and blah, 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 blah. So I do think that it seems to me, anyway, from where I'm sitting, that teams were overvaluing their first-round picks, and because of that, nothing ended up getting done, and the dominoes just kind of never fell.
If that trade did go through, it could go the other way, though, because it could establish the market price there. Okay, so to get into the early lottery there, you got to give up a proven guy, at least defensively, like Nerlens Noel, a solid rotation player like Covington, and then you have those 24 and 26 picks, which are going to be, as Eric mentioned, incredibly valuable down the road.
Yes, and it would have set the market for those early lottery picks, but it also subsequently would have set the market for those later lottery picks that would have been comparatively not as valuable. And that's what I think maybe would have happened is if that deal would have gone down, Boston would have been compelled to maybe deal some more of their later first round or maybe early second round picks. I think that would have kind of lubricated the whole trade process across the league, and it just didn't end up happening.
So we're talking in hypotheticals right now. We're making guesses about what happened. The bottom line is there were almost no trades for draft picks in the first round. Really, there were only 2, that 22nd overall and then the Teague pick we talked about. The Blazers didn't have the pieces to do a Teague type of move. And guess what? 28 other GMs struck out on buying into the back half of the first round of the draft. 24 teams, Brandon's saying. And so that to me means that Neil O'Shea was not an exception. The bottom line was that he was just like every single other GM, and he was unable to get in. And so it's hard to criticize him when he was basically the norm.
Okay, I got one word, 4 syllables. Bellinelli. Okay, that got you a first round pick.
But
so,
we have to assume that's a fluke. I mean, there's no way. That has to be a fluke, right? Based on the Teague trade and based on what other teams were hopefully willing to give up.
Maybe he has pictures of someone. I don't know.
Maybe Rich Cho just really likes Marco Bellinelli.
So in terms of what the Blazers would be willing to give up, I'm going to go ahead and assume that they're not willing to give up Aminu or Ed Davis for that pick. I'm assuming Noah Vonleh is probably going to be someone they want to keep on, hold on to, considering how young he is, how affordable he is, how much upside he seems to have. So that leaves Mason Plumlee to trade. Maybe they didn't want to trade Mason Plumlee for the number 22 pick. It could be as simple as that. Who else could they have traded? I don't think Connaughton or Alexander or Luis Montero, as poor of a season as Bellinelli had last year, I don't think any combination of those 3 players gets you that number 22 pick. Maybe Mason Plumlee was just too valuable to get rid of for that.
I think that's fair. And if you look at it in a vacuum, if you were to say, should the Blazers trade Mason Plumlee for, like a lower mid-20s pick, I think most Blazers fans would reject that deal. I mean, what you have out of Mason Plumlee is about as much as you're going to need or expect out of a late first rounder. In my view, you have someone who's a starting level player, maybe not a starter on most teams in the league, but a starting level player. So, I mean, the thing about when we're conceptualizing the different deals that could have happened and the various ways that they could have gone down is that it can be immensely complicated because, as I said earlier, one deal can lead to other deals being facilitated. And so, as Eric said, nothing ended up happening. The Blazers didn't move very much, and I guess that's just the reality that we're dealing with now.
So the one thing, Brandon, that the Blazers could have maybe benefited from in dealing Plumlee is that it would have reset his rookie scale. And what I mean by that is he has 1 year left as a cheap rookie contract. It would have given them another guy who's just starting on a cheap rookie contract. But if that guy's a bust, then you've got nothing in exchange for Plumlee. And so I'd rather have Plumlee's restricted free agent rights, personally.
I suppose the Blazers also had that 2018 Cleveland Cavaliers first rounder as well, which could have been involved in a trade. So,
but Chris, what we just talked about how the picks this year are more valuable than they're going to be in 2018. LeBron said, "I'm staying in Cleveland," and I'm taking that as I'm staying in Cleveland for life. NWO shout out. Now that they have that, took him a second. Now that they have that title, and so that Cleveland pick in 2018 with Irving and LeBron is most likely going to be a 27th or 28th in a worse year financially. And so I don't think that pick's going to get you much. That's going to be a sweetener for you to get a 25th pick this year.
Can we just spend like 10 seconds? I'm so happy that LeBron won a championship in Cleveland. I don't know how you guys feel. I was like so stoked about that. I'm very happy about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's pretty dope. I mean, you look at, I don't know, it's kind of like the letter that he wrote was a bit, I don't want to criticize it too hard, but
written by a PR person, probably.
There you go. And
yeah.
And so I don't know if I question the authenticity, but I do question the execution of it.
But did you watch the speech though? Because that was kind of awesome as far as championship speeches go.
Yeah,
it was good.
It's amazing, and you see immediately after the game falling to the floor with tears in his eyes, J.R. Smith
took his shirt off.
Shirt off.
Didn't put it back on for weeks. Some say he's still shirtless to this day.
Yeah, Richard Jefferson at the tail end of his career after falling short and getting close so many times early on in his career,
announces his retirement on the spot. That's like the classic, like
such
the
a
ultimate
power move.
Yeah,
and he may be coming back. He did say that he may be interested in coming back next season.
I hate that move. I hope he doesn't. I hope he stays retired. Perfect ending.
We'll call it the Jordan, the coming back after retiring perfectly.
So I do like the storybook ending, and I think it's great for the fans of. I mean, I don't feel particularly bad for Cleveland for not having won in however many decades it has been in all their major sports, because they have a baseball team, they have an NFL team, and they have a National Basketball Association team. The Blazers haven't won since '77, and in Portland, we don't have any other professional franchises that could bring the city of Portland a championship anyway.
I mean, that means they have triple the odds, and they still didn't do it. So that's kind of worse, right?
Triple the heartache.
Go Cleveland.
Sure, but it's less likely for Portland fans to get a championship anytime in the near future.
That's
so I don't have a ton of sympathy for fans in Cleveland.
Brandon, can you throw me the oven mitts?
Yeah, here you go, buddy. Oven mitts right to you.
So I'm putting the oven mitts on, and I'm going to say this. LeBron James is now the third best player in NBA history, behind Michael Jordan and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. We can argue, but at worst, he's the fifth best if you want to throw Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain above him. At worst, fifth best player ever.
You know what's so crazy is that's not even an oven mitt statement at this point. I mean, it's maybe we're prisoners of the moment, but honestly, when you look at LeBron James's career, by the way, the guy's only 31. He has tons of miles, but he's 31. He's got some years left.
He's going to own every single career playoff record, every single one when it's done. It's going to look like Wilt Chamberlain's scoring regular season record. It's not going to be close either.
I have to say, I became a de facto Cleveland Cavaliers fan the moment that Steph Curry tapped his wrist at the Moda Center. That's it. I was so happy that LeBron won. I can't even tell you.
Okay, so I saw a lot of fans when Steph Curry did that get really, really upset. And I remember, I guess I don't remember so well. I think it was January when the Blazers had that late fourth quarter flurry to come back and beat the Oklahoma City Thunder in OKC. Do you guys remember Damian Lillard doing Dame time in OKC?
But that's his move. The thing that makes the Steph Curry tapping his wrist so abhorrent is that he's stealing someone else's move, right? So if Damian Lillard had gone to Oklahoma City, and what does Russell Westbrook do? Just scream a bunch?
Okay, so let's say the Blazers had a crazy come-from-behind win in Houston, and CJ McCollum does the cooking thing that James Harden does. We would all be saying, oh my God, that's so funny. James Harden sucks. CJ McCollum's the he does the muscle flex. Ed Davis does the muscle flex.
I would have loved it. It would have been amazing.
No. I mean, it would have been amazing, but I wouldn't have been a fan of it. I mean, I can say that
you would have been a fan of it. Absolutely, you would have.
I am being perfectly objective. I am not an emotional person, right? I'm perfectly rational all the time. No, I wouldn't have been a fan. I just think that, like, especially the thing with Steph Curry, he's the best player in the world. You have to mock somebody else? Really?
Yeah, and you can get away with it because you're the best.
Yeah, why not?
I'm so glad.
He's the only one who can mock everyone else.
I'm just so glad he lost. That's all.
And to be fair, he got his comeuppance because LeBron blocked him, 6 times in the finals, which that must be some kind of, like, MVP worst case scenario record.
That last block on Iggy, holy mackerel, dude.
He covered ground really. I mean, he went from, like, the high block to the rim in, like, a quarter of a second. That was insane.
So I'm not specifically mad about the Steph Curry celebration. I mean, sure, it was taunting the crowd, but NBA players do that. Blazers players have done that in the past, and we've thought, this is amazing. This is so awesome. We've been behind our players when they've done it. Generally speaking.
When has Damian Lillard ever mocked another player's celebration? Ever? I don't think so.
Bill Walton is on the record in Breaks of the Game saying that he used to love mocking the opposing crowd.
Bill Walton,
greatest Blazer of all time, is on the record saying he loved mocking the opposing crowd.
I'm sorry. What year is it?
Hey, this is a shout out for Mortimer and all the other, I don't want to say old timers, but classic Blazer fans. All the other classic Blazer fans out there.
Mortimer is not as old as his username would suggest. But
really?
Anyway.
Oh, wow. Learned something new tonight. All right, Blazer fan since 1970. I'm going to guess he is as old as his username suggests.
There you go. And so the LeBron James, the Cleveland, that's all such a feel-good thing. That's all so lovely. But I'm looking at this 73 win regular season that the Warriors had, And I personally am kind of disappointed that they didn't bring that through to completion.
It don't mean a thing without that ring.
Exactly. And that's the thing, because I thought this team, I thought it was, I mean, I didn't get too much into the 95-96 Bulls versus the Warriors talk, but I think to be able to watch an historically great team the way we did this year with the Warriors in the regular season, I think it would have just been really special for them to really follow that through all the way to the finals. And then they could say, look, 73 wins for the regular season, tied it up with a championship. This is unquestionably, I guess I shouldn't say unquestionably, but this is debatably the best team in NBA history. I think that would have been just as interesting, if not more, than LeBron and the Cleveland Cavaliers getting the championship.
The thing that we as NBA fans were blessed with this year, and I think the ratings definitely back this up, is that we had two incredible storylines. For as much as people who want to be analysts want to kind of shy away from the storyline part of what makes basketball interesting, that is a huge part of what makes basketball interesting and fun and accessible, by the way. So you had, like you said, the 73-win Warriors against LeBron James at the apex of his career. He is never going to be better than he is this year. He's 31 with a ton of miles, going home to Cleveland. All of his players are healthy. He wants to win one for the land. It's an incredible storyline. I'm not sure. I'm trying to think across the league and the different narratives that you can come up with. I'm not sure that you could come up with a better 1-2 matchup than the Warriors and the Cavaliers, and I'm really happy with how it played out. I mean, I'm happy the fact that it even happened in the first place. I'm really happy it went 7 games, and like I've said a couple times, I'm really glad the Cavaliers won for sure.
And you're right. This was the highest-rated finals since Michael Jordan in 1998, which is a pretty awesome accomplishment for. I don't want to say that. It's a pretty awesome sign of how popular Curry and LeBron are right now. And the thing to remember about that, too, is that the playoffs this year were terrible for the most part. Chris and I talked on the podcast about 3 weeks ago about how every single game was a blowout. And there was the only good series I can remember, really, truly classic series, was that Thunder Warriors series. And even the finals were mostly blowouts. Despite that, the most watched game since 1998. That's pretty impressive.
And you have to take into account in the last 18 years the way technology has changed. So if the TV ratings were as good as they were in 1998 or better, you have to consider how many people were watching the game, the finals, via other means. I mean, so this was not only on TV, but in general, this was a massively watched NBA finals.
Yeah, and that includes me. ESPN did us all a solid and had their Watch ESPN app was free and untethered from providers, because I mean, I'm one of the many people who they don't have cable TV. I have internet. I pay a good amount of money per month for it. I feel like I should be able to watch NBA games.
Get an antenna. That was over the air.
I'm not getting an antenna for my
you don't have a TV
for my DisplayPort connected monitor. I don't know if that's gonna work.
Okay, so I do have I have a Comcast subscription. I have basic cable, so I do get ABC where the games were televised, but I did have to watch on the ESPN3 app because for some freaking reason I got the Spanish broadcast of the finals. That happened to me when I was when you guys did the podcast when I was in Hawaii on my honeymoon, which was amazing, by the way. That could be a whole other podcast. Yeah, the broadcast was in Spanish. Like the first quarter was in Spanish, and then there was no commentary, which actually was cool. By the way, they should make that an option. If you're streaming the game, you should be able to toggle the commentary to just hear the crowd and the court noise and the announcer. It's actually a really neat experience.
Do you have surround sound? You can kind of do that. If you turn off your center channel, it'll kind of replicate that. You'll get like a shadowy announcer effect, basically. But you need actual audio equipment to set that up.
I had all 48 minutes of all 7 games in the Spanish broadcast, and
wow,
while it was interesting because the Spanish announcers, they bring a different type of flair than American. I mean, just the language is more, I think it's more conducive to excitement, and so just listening to it and not having any clue what they were saying other than the names of the players and the teams and the coaches, it was actually, I did end up watching a handful of games on the Spanish broadcast. It did end up being interesting, but Comcast, get your stuff together. Whatever it was that glitched out for me, I did end up going through the ESPN3 app to get that. But moving on, I wanna rehash one last topic. We've gone over this a number of times in the last a year and a half or so since this went down. Hindsight being 2020, I think now we can kind of look at it and judge it in its proper context. Early Thursday, or I should say early Friday, on Blazers Edge, staff writer Evans Clinchey, shout out, he's been a guest on the pod before. Also, he's written about the Celtics in the past, and I think he's a bit of a Celtics fan, so hearts go out to you, Evans Clinchey.
And he's also been a frequent guest of Peter Sampson's radio show that you can find every Tuesday at noon on X-Ray FM. So just to give a shout out to that too.
What are the numbers for that? There we go. Sorry, go ahead.
107.1 X-Ray FM. Tune into that Tuesdays at noon. Evan Clinchey and Peter Sampson. But Evans early Friday wrote a post about the Afflalo trade last spring. So we all know that the Blazers, they were in playoff contention. This was, I believe it was after Aldridge had hurt his thumb, but it was after he'd also come back, and it was pre-Wesley injury. So I'm not going to say there were 0 injuries going into the trade, but in terms of injuries that were going to affect the playoffs, I'm going to say that they hadn't the other foot hadn't fallen, so to speak. So Arron Afflalo to the Blazers for Will Barton, Thomas Robinson, and a lottery-protected first-round draft pick.
So, and Victor Claver.
Oh, sorry, Victor Claver. I left you out on that. So that trade goes down last spring. Eric, you have a little bit of insight into how the Blazers were playing with Afflalo before the Wesley Matthews injury. Would you mind sharing that with us?
Yeah, I don't want to take full credit for this. This was actually something that Blazer Edge commenter and user Douglas T pointed out. And of course, I lost my notes. But the takeaway from what he pointed out on the article Evans wrote earlier today on Blazers Edge was that the Blazers were absolutely smoking with Arron Afflalo in the lineup. What they did was, once he got integrated, so they lost their first game, but then after that, they won 5 consecutive games, and 4 of them were against playoff contenders. They blew out the Spurs, they beat the Thunder, they beat the Kings, they beat the Clippers, and then they blew out Dallas. And that was the game Wes Matthews blew out, wrecked his Achilles tendon. And so 5 games in a row, all victories, 4 of them were against playoff opponents. They were absolutely rolling immediately with Afflalo in the lineup, I think is the takeaway.
Well, and the other thing to remember, too, is like how good were the Blazers that year up until that point? They were one of the better teams in the league, which was absolutely insane. I mean, I'm trying to put myself back where the team was just such a short time ago and what a different world it was. How stoked I was when LaMarcus Aldridge came back to that thumb injury and had that monster game, like the first game back. And yeah, the Blazers were a really, really good team. So when you have the opportunity to trade players that are not getting a ton of playing time for someone who is a legitimate rotation piece, in my mind, you have to do it. Like, in my mind, there was absolutely nothing wrong with that trade at all. I was a huge fan of it then, and despite the fact that Wesley Matthews got injured, I am still a huge fan of it now.
And just to reiterate what you're saying, Brandon, LaMarcus Aldridge with that thumb injury and I know a lot of people, he's not necessarily citizen number 1 anymore in Portland, but he played through that thumb injury because he believed the team had a legit chance to win and could not afford to be missing him for a month. So he was all in on championship potential at that point. Afflalo, one of the first things he said when he picked up the Blazers, when he was picked up by the Blazers, was that we're going to win it all this year. And so that team, those guys were all in on making a run. And as a fan, that has to be super exciting because those players know when it's hopeless, their hope is lost. And those guys did not at all think it was hopeless. They absolutely were convinced they were going to make a run.
And at the time of the trade, I'm trying to think of it. I'm trying to think that there's 3 or so like pretty likely options, or I guess options that Neil O'Shea probably had to take into consideration there. So either the Blazers keep all of their guys, Afflalo opts into his player option for 2015-2016, and right now we might be talking about the Blazers being 2016 NBA champions if injuries didn't decimate the roster last season, or LaMarcus leaves, they get rid of everybody else, the Blazers end up in the lottery, that pick is protected so they still have it anyway, or the third option, which I think is in Blazer fans' minds, I think in the front office's mind, I think in everybody's minds, this third option was the least likely, was that the Blazers would lose LaMarcus Aldridge and lose everybody else and make the playoffs this year. I just don't see how anybody thought that was likely. I think the lottery protection there was a pretty solid move, and I think considering everything that we knew and what the front office knew at the time, I can't get too down on them for making that trade when they did.
And by least likely, you mean if you told me that exactly 1 year ago not exactly 11 months ago from today, I would have told you were insane. There is no chance they're making the playoffs. And I'm sure Neil O'Shea, whether or not he wants to admit it, would have thought the same thing. And so to me, if you take away the super unlikely occurrence that actually somehow transpired, it becomes a meh. Just kind of, it was a move. It didn't work out. And there weren't any real major consequences in hindsight.
One consequence, I'm not going to say major though, was Will Barton. In Denver, he ended up being an incredibly is probably a bit of hyperbole. He ended up being a productive player, and they ended up signing him to a very reasonable contract. I think it was 3 years, $11 million. That's going to look like a pretty solid bargain. The way that Will Barton turned out, that's a disappointment that the Blazers, I guess, don't have him. But in my eyes, I don't think he really fit what Terry Stotts was trying to do with the offense. He was kind of a high usage guy. Also, I think it wouldn't have allowed CJ McCollum to bust out the way that he did in the playoffs and early this season. Furthermore, if I'm looking at Will Barton's stats, the way he was playing for the Blazers up to that trade, he had been in 30 of 50 games, I think. So he had roughly 20 did not play coaches' decisions. He was averaging 10 minutes a game. A lot of that was garbage time. He was pretty much out of the rotation. He was shooting 38% from the floor and 22% from three. I mean, if you look back today and you look the way he performed for the Denver Nuggets, who, they had a lot of injuries. They had a fire sale. I mean, they got rid of one of their best players in Afflalo. They were playing some pretty bad players. I think that is kind of a case of guy gets sent to a new situation where he's given minutes on a bad team. And if you shoot the ball as many times as Will Barton did, I mean, he does have talent. I think it's not too surprising that he's able to be productive on a team like Denver.
I mean, it is interesting and, dare I say, tantalizing to imagine Will Barton on a Blazers team, even like they were this year, where they were not expected to perform all that well. He would have been a very interesting. I'm not sure if he would have taken all that many minutes from CJ McCollum. I could definitely envision a scenario in which CJ McCollum still becomes sixth man of the year, but Will Barton becomes a relatively reliable rotation player with the Blazers. But go for it.
If Barton doesn't get those minutes, then he's not going to be the player that he ended up being in Denver, right? So to me, I'm looking at it and saying it's either CJ McCollum does his thing or Will Barton does his thing. There's not room for both of them to do it, right?
Have I used up my quota of really old analogies yet? I'm going to say no. So
not quite yet. You're running up against it, though.
Last one. Okay. He is a poor man's Billy Ray Bates, is how I look at it. And what I mean by that, for those who are super familiar with Blazer history, probably unnecessarily so, in the late 1970s / early 1980s, 1979-80 season, the Blazers were beset by injury and basically dysfunction, and the team's system completely fell apart. Jack Ramsey, the system coach, just lost his beautiful flow offense because of personnel. In steps Billy Ray Bates, takes over a bunch of games, freestyles the Blazers to a playoff victory. I see Will Barton the same way in Denver. He was unable to really work within the system that Stotts has set up. He was more of a freelance type of guy who needed that, not necessarily isolation, but kind of roster dysfunction on the offensive end to thrive. He found that in Denver, and he thrived. I don't think he was ever going to find that with the Terry Stotts team.
Well, I mean, one way you could see a player like that being used, even in a system like the Blazers have now, is if you had a person coming off of the bench who was meant to be disruptive, who was meant to kind of not only keep your offense going, but keep the opposing defenses guessing. Someone like that could be extremely valuable, even in a team like the Blazers that do have such a strong system. So, I mean, I could hypothetically see that, where you see the Blazers have actually gone in that direction a couple different times. Mo Williams and Jamal Crawford come to mind.
They still were playing within Stotts' flow offense. Jamal Crawford circa 2013, maybe, not with the Blazers though, because that team was a mess. And you're right, that Vinnie Johnson microwave, flash in a pan scorer off the bench, certainly has a role for a lot of teams. But I don't see that with Stotts' teams. I don't see the bench unit coming in and running a different style of offense. I see a lot of coherence with the team on the floor. They're running the same sets no matter who's out there.
Man, the microwave, you are hitting that 45 to 54 demographic super hard this podcast.
Hey, everyone knows Vinnie Johnson.
Also, I'd like to say for the record, best nickname in NBA history, microwave. But
no doubt.
Second best nickname in NBA history, Cool Breeze. He wouldn't have busted out the way that he did this season had Will Barton still been on the team, or Will Barton wouldn't have. I mean, there just wouldn't have been as many minutes in the backcourt for the Blazers to do what they did.
When Alan Crabb gets a $16 or $17 million offer from the Knicks and the Blazers lose him, you're going to wish that Barton was here to take some of his playing time.
Ooh.
My God. I don't even know what to say to that, man.
We're not trying to get into the depths of despair on this podcast, Eric.
I'm sorry. Is that the depths of despair? I kind of like watching the Knicks overpay and fail.
I don't want to see Cool Breeze go anywhere either. I hope he gives a hometown discount. It's probably not likely at all, but
there's absolutely zero reason why he would not cash into his fullest ability this summer. So props to him if he's able to net 15, 16, 17 million from a team like the Knicks. If he gets it, I say take it, just like we said last summer when Robin Lopez was offered like 13 million from the Knicks. It was great having you in Portland, but the Knicks are more than welcome to pay you $12 million a year.
So how about this scenario? How about the Blazers let him go this year and they use the money to sign, let's say, Al Horford, and then in 4 years with his player option, Cool Breeze opts out, and now after he's made $50 million, he comes back for $12 million to the Blazers for the hometown discount and is the piece that puts them over the edge, playing the Vinnie Johnson role.
I like that you're able to project out into the 2020s as far as what the Blazers are going to do. I did definitely appreciate that.
Hey, you said no more downers, and I can't think of anything better than Alan Crabb coming back in 4 years and being the difference maker for a championship.
No doubt.
Let's end on one note here, because you brought up Al Horford. Eric, there was a little bit of tidbit last night, I believe, from A. Woj about Horford that may or may not have an effect on some Blazer fans' plans for the team this summer, right?
Yeah, and I didn't actually hear this myself, so hopefully some of our listeners did, but apparently during his draft podcast extravaganza thing, he accidentally, slip of the tongue style, said, since Al Horford's going back to the Hawks or something similar. So there is a potential rumor that may be true that Al Horford is probably going back to the Hawks.
My favorite take on that rumor is not that he had a slip of the tongue, but that he intentionally made it seem as though there was a slip of the tongue to lead people to believe that that's what he thought, but it's not really what he thinks. I love that we're in an era of NBA basketball, which I never got to experience as a child, where this is the type of thing that all three of us can be talking about. It's lovely.
And there's still hope there, I think, for Al Horford fans who want to see him in a Blazer uniform sign a free agent contract this summer. Now, the Atlanta Hawks could offer him that 5th year, which would be paying him roughly $28 million, I think, as a 35-year-old. So that's not the most appealing thing in the world for a team to be paying a guy at that age. If I doubt he's going to remain as productive. But anyway, they can offer him that 5th year, but they did trade Jeff Teague, who was a pretty big part of that team. Paul Millsap, I think he's about 32. I know he's pushing the early 30s there. There's a chance that the Atlanta Hawks actually do end up blowing things up this summer. That Jeff Teague trade could be the first chip to fall. Al Horford being 30 years old, and the thought of paying him as a 35-year-old almost $30 million may not be that enticing to the Atlanta Hawks, and that's probably what it's going to take to keep him around. So Blazer fans, rest assured that there is still hope that Al Horford could be leaving Atlanta if that's who you've targeted. But we're going to wrap up the Blazers Edge podcast this week. Brandon, as always, thank you for coming on the show as my co-host. Eric Goldner, I'm going to call you the...
Eric Goldner? Who's that?
Eric Goldner. This is payback. This is payback for the podcast a couple months ago when I wasn't on and Brandon called Eric Chris like 7 times.
That's
so
true.
I'm coming out as a loser in both cases.
Oh yeah, I guess
Wow.
that's right. That is a lose-lose for you.
So Chris, I know a guest who will not be invited back onto the weekend podcast for sure.
Brandon Griffith.
Eric Goldner.
Oh God.
Eric Griffith, I want to thank you, man, for coming on a Friday night. I'm gonna consider you the 2.5 co-host of the Blazers Edge podcast. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I can be the ace in the hole when you guys, when the guest no shows, I'm here ready to pinch hit.
All right, thanks, man. We'll have you back again soon.
Thanks for having me, guys. Later.
Episode 148 of the Blazers Edge podcast is now in the books. I'd like to thank you all for joining us this week. I'd also like to thank Blazers Edge staff writer Eric Griffith for coming on the program.
Isn't his name Eric Goldner? Didn't you say that during the pod? No, it's always good to have Eric on. And as always, our intro and outro beats are brought to you by Odar. If you like it and you want to check out his work, you can always slide on over to soundcloud.com/OdarBeats. Please be sure to tune in to the midweek podcast with managing editor Dave Deckard and Dan Meringue. We are taking the weekend off so you can catch the Fanalists with Tara and Joe this weekend. But until next time, for Chris Lucia, I'm Brandon Goldner. And remember, if your light bulb is too hot, you probably shouldn't try to take it out of the socket. Eric Goldner.